In this part of our series in the Global South, we'll look at Brazil's long pursuit of influence and how it sees its place in a changing global order. Ryan, Brazil sees itself as a country that should have a voice in shaping world affairs. That's really not new. How far back does Brazil's ambition to be a global player go?
Well, it goes back at least to the Second World War, where Brazil saw itself on the right side of history. It sent forces to the European theater, one of the only Latin American countries to do so. And it very much thought of itself as being part of that group of countries that could be the benefactors of the spoils of the victories of war. And from Brazil's perspective, it hasn't reaped those fruits, while the United States, United Kingdom, France, other European powers have.
And this relationship with the United States has swung back and forth, cooperation, frustration. How has that relationship evolved, and what does it look like today in the face of glowing U.S.-China competition?
U.S.-Brazil ties have usually been pretty warm over the years. Culturally, Brazilians are very, very oriented towards the United States. I think they would much rather take a trip from São Paulo to Miami or to Orlando or to New York than they would to Beijing, certainly to Moscow. But where we get into more difficult aspects of the relationship is with Brazil's long relationship with China and how China has been expanding that relationship into more and more strategic sectors.
What is Brazil trying to do through the BRICS?
Well, Brazil is very proud of being the B in BRICS, and its participation in BRICS has been supported enthusiastically by the foreign ministry in Brasilia. I think Brazil looks at it as part of its effort to, quote, democratize international relations. So this is about inclusion. This is about forums where more voices can be heard. It's not necessarily for Brazil about pushing a Moscow or Beijing-based viewpoint on the future of global order. In fact, I would argue, as Brazil has seen the BRICS expand beyond its original five with South Africa members, its influence has been diluted.
Is there a separate Brazil strategy toward the global South, separate from the BRICS?
I think there very much is a separate Brazil strategy. The BRICS are an important part of that strategy, but I think that's not the only part of their strategy. And Brazil has a lot of influence in certain Lusophone countries in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, these kinds of countries that were also colonized by the Portuguese. Lots of residual influence there. And of course, Brazil claims to speak on the international stage for much of or all of Latin America.
For this part of our series, we shift the focus to Mexico, a middle power that is uniquely close to the United States. Ryan, Mexico is sometimes called the pivotal state, part of the global North and part of the global South. Where did this idea come from, and how has it evolved?
Well, I think the idea comes from the simple geographic fact that Mexico is both a Latin American country and also part of North America. And it likes to be able to straddle those two realities. So it is still very much a developing state, which, and culturally, linguistically, historically, puts it firmly in Latin America. But geographically and in terms of where it's hitched its wagons, very much a North American country. Which frankly, I think recognizes, if you're in Mexico's shoes, the fact that you don't really have another game other than kind of hitching your wagons to the United States, given 83% of your exports go to the United States.
You know, in my ignorance, I've often thought of Mexico as a producer of agricultural goods, because when I go to the supermarket, I see Mexican tomatoes and avocados and so on. And I'm shocked to see that so much of Mexican exports to the United States are actually manufactured goods. How has that explosion in trade, especially in manufactured goods, affected the bilateral relationship with the United States?
Well, almost $1 million worth of goods basically crosses the border every minute between the United States and Mexico. So it's a tremendous amount of trade. We have not only given Mexico the opportunity to develop by bringing it into the North American relationship, but I would argue that over the years, anti-Americanism, although it is still existent in Mexico, has been reduced dramatically as the two countries have grown closer on the economic level.
Mexico's closeness to the United States must give it a completely unique view of great power competition. What is their view of great power competition?
I think you have to look at the previous government in Mexico and say that it has changed with the present government in Mexico. So the previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, I would argue had a much more kind of equidistant approach, similar to the way Brazil thinks about finding equidistance between Washington and Beijing. And I think the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has understood that Mexico's future is with North America. When you have 83% of your exports oriented around exporting to one market, many of them manufactured goods, as you said, for the U.S. market. The U.S. and to a lesser extent Canada are kind of the only games in town. And you can diversify around the edges and you can open up trade agreements to find other markets. But for the most part, Mexico is going to remain very, very much dependent on the United States.
In this segment of our series, we'll focus on India and its drive to be a global player. Rick, India sees itself as more than just a regional power. How long has that been the case?
I suppose it really began around the turn of the last century when India was pushing for its own independence and really pressed out to find like-minded countries, countries that have been colonized, to try to find support them as well. And even after independence, to try to find countries that didn't want to become embedded in the Cold War and align themselves either with the United States or the Soviet Union. So trying to find a bit of a middle path.
But it also feels like India is very careful not to get too closely aligned with the United States.
Well, you've got rhetoric that makes it sound like they desire that. But if you look in practice, I think about it in the three main buckets: on defense relations, on people-to-people ties, and on economic commercial ties. They are by far the most entrenched in the U.S. when you think about economic relationships. We're the largest export destination for goods, the largest export destination for services, the largest source of foreign investment. So on the economic side, we are the most integrated. On defense, Russia has had a primary role as a major supplier of defense equipment, but the United States over time has been supplanting. But if you look at the numbers, whether it's commercial, people-to-people, and increasing on the military, we are the partner of choice. So sometimes the numbers don't quite match up with the rhetoric perfectly.
We hear a lot about India wanting to reform the global order. How does India think about the challenge of, on the one hand, reforming the global order, and on the other hand, benefiting from the global order?
There's only going to be 3 massive economies in the world, and India's going to be one of them. That's not 10 generations away. It's a generation away. And they don't want to wait for that. They want to get their place at the tables they think that they've been kind of excluded from so far, have a larger say in the Bretton Woods institutions. They love a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. They want these kind of standards as a way to show that they are indeed a major power.
India's played a large role in the BRICS organization. Where does India want to take BRICS? What's their vision?
I consider BRICS to be a bit like a fallback or a running car that isn't yet moving anywhere. They want to keep it gassed up and ready to go, just in case partnership with the United States goes in dangerous directions, partnership with Europe or something like that. And if they need a second vehicle to help them meet their own goals in terms of economic development, military cooperation, things like that, BRICS is something that they can slide into relatively easily. And if India says go, I think it's got a much higher chance of moving.
As part of our series on rising powers in the global south, we turn now to Indonesia. Greg, how do Indonesians see their place in the world?
I think Indonesians recognize that being the 4th largest country on earth, the 3rd largest democracy, gives them a weight, a heft, a role to play, but one that is still being felt out.
They've used that phrase, rowing between 2 reefs. What does that mean?
This goes all the way back to the founding father of modern Indonesia, Sukarno. It's the idea that Indonesia cannot pick sides, but it's not a term that means neutrality. That gets thrown out there too often. It's about Indonesia maintaining its own agency.
What's happened to the U.S.-Indonesia relationship when U.S.-China competition has been rising in Southeast Asia?
Both U.S. and China play for a bigger part of the market, bigger part of the strategic relationship with Indonesia, and Indonesia has been smart enough to try to take advantage of that, to play to both sides, as it always has. That's what rowing between 2 reefs means.
Does Indonesia look for American protection against Chinese expansion in Southeast Asia, or is it really looking for opportunities to be attractive to everybody?
So there is a often a distrust of Chinese intentions, but it's not seen as an overt military threat. On the economic front, Indonesians tend to be very happy with engagement by both the US and China, although they want it on their own terms, and that can be frustrating to both Washington and to Beijing.
When President Trump moved forward with the Hamas deal to help end the fighting in Gaza, there were some meetings in the UN, and Indonesia was present in those meetings, in some ways blessing this plan to end the war. Did that surprise you at all?
It's not surprising. Indonesia has never tried to play as active a role in the Middle East as, say, Malaysia, its neighbor, has. It has always tried to maintain a degree of balance between the West and others. So, for instance, Indonesia does not have a Hamas representative office the way that neighboring Malaysia does. That means that it is more likely to be seen as a balanced player, a fair player by the West. But at the same time, it has played a very active role in terms of civil society organizations. So Indonesia was well positioned to be one of those states that I think both the Middle East and the West would look to help put its imprimatur on this, to give it a degree of international legitimacy.
What drives Saudi Arabia's foreign policy?
Years ago, the Harvard political scientist Nadav Safran wrote a book called Saudi Arabia, The Ceaseless Quest for Security. Since its founding, Saudi Arabia has been concerned about how do you keep the country safe. It has a dangerous neighborhood. And so Saudi Arabia has always sought to build relationships, especially with the United States, that would keep Saudi Arabia safe. But part of the driver behind Saudi Arabia building a close relationship with China is they want China to feel that it has an interest in Saudi security, and the Chinese-Iranian relationship means that China can keep Iran at bay.
How does Saudi Arabia view its ties to the United States, Russia, and China, respectively?
You know, the United States was present at the creation for Saudi Arabia. There's a special role the United States plays. And again, I think the Saudis picked the United States because they were confident the United States wouldn't try to become an imperial power and exploit Saudi Arabia. That being said, there also was a sense that Saudi Arabia needed more options. There was an effort several years ago to deepen ties with China, partly because China was such an important market, but I think also to send a message to the United States that Saudi Arabia had more options.
Is there anything notable about Saudi Arabia's relationship with Russia?
You know, Russia's a major energy exporter. And at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when there was a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, both sides got hurt. You know, China's a place that Saudis think this country has a future. I've never spoken to a Saudi who thinks that Russia has much of a future.
Does the Saudi leadership seem to worry about how the global order works at all?
I don't think they do. I think they see themselves in a position where they can get who they need to get on the phone when the time comes. That's the way Saudi Arabia works, that the way you get services is you can get a senior person to respond. I think the Saudis are quite confident they can always get senior people to respond, whether it's in Beijing or Moscow or Washington. I don't ever get a sense they care about how the whole system works. They care about being able to advance the interests of Saudi Arabia because there's so much of a concentrated power structure. They've been very good at getting the attention of world leaders when they want the attention of world leaders. We now turn to South Africa, which emerged from apartheid, but to become one of the political and economic leaders in Africa. Catherine, how did South Africa make the transition from political symbol to key diplomatic and economic actor?
In 1994, when South Africa was emerging as this democracy, it already had a relatively advanced economy compared to the region and really the continent. So South Africa, due to its location, its natural resources, and its diversified economy, is now the most economically diverse economy in Africa, and it is also the most technologically advanced.
What are South Africa's global ambitions as opposed to its regional ones?
So the best demonstration of South Africa's global ambitions are actually from what it's done with its G20 presidency this year. South Africa chose to focus on three key issues. The first being the debt crisis that is crippling so many developing countries. The second goal is climate financing, so climate adaptation. And the third, related to that, is building out climate resilient infrastructure for countries that are particularly affected by these climate disasters.
As it thinks about the new global order, how does it think about relating to the United States, China, and Russia?
So during the apartheid era, even though in the 80s and the 90s, the US became a champion of the anti-apartheid cause, prior to that, the US was either implicitly in support of the apartheid government or neutral in the matter, compared to the then Soviet Union and China that offered support to figures like Mandela and the ANC. And so you fast forward to today, I think that South Africa sees itself as a partner of all three countries, right?
South Africa seems to talk a lot about fairness in international relations. How do South Africans think you should judge fairness?
South Africa sees common challenges that span the globe, right? Climate, debt, and so on. But how both those crises are created and the consequences of them are not applied equally across countries in the world. And so what South Africa sees as fairness is a global system that works to help those without the means or the resources that they need to address these common issues.
As part of our series on the rise of the global south, we turn to Turkey, a country that has evolved from its role as a reliable Western ally to be more of an independent global actor. Max, when did Turkish leaders begin to see themselves more independently as they look to their foreign policy?
Well, I think there's a few moments. I think the end of the Cold War was a really significant turning point in the sense that even during the 1990s, without the threat of communism, without the threat of the Soviet Union, the ties that really bound Turkey to NATO and the West dissipated. But then you have Erdogan coming onto the scene, the AKP party in the early 2000s, and begin to shift away from Ataturk's more secular approach of Turkish identity, then a bit more Middle East focused, a bit more focused on the Islamic world than on Europe.
And they also work closely with Russia. They work closely with China. How did they balance between the great powers?
So I think one of the things that Turkey has done a good job of, if your foreign policy pursuit is one of strategic autonomy, is Turkey has been able to establish a business-like relationship with Russia, even though they were on the cusp of military conflict in Syria and were on the opposite sides. With China, I think there's also an interest in having a business-like relationship with China at times. There's real economic conflict there where it's not always in Turkey's interest to have China in Turkey. For instance, the Belt and Road Initiative. Turkey does a lot of construction, having the Chinese do construction. There's some tension and conflict there. But wanting to sort of be at the table, be at as many tables as possible, whether that's at BRICS, whether that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you see Turkey wanting to be at all tables.
Is there any Turkish sense of how the global order should work? And what would a Turkish influenced global order look like?
Well, I think Turkey's vision of the global order is one that is quite transactional, one that is not values-based, especially as President Erdogan is rolling back a lot of the democracy and human rights protections that have existed in Turkey. So one that where sovereignty is sacrosanct, where you don't pay attention to the internal workings of other countries.
What does that mean for the future of Turkey in an organization like NATO?
So I think it's always going to be fraught. I think it's going to be fraught as long as Turkey pursues a foreign policy of strategic autonomy, because the whole point of NATO is that you're not really going to be strategically autonomous. And if Turkey continues on its direction, I think the EU could in fact start to take more punitive steps towards Turkey that would lead to a real fracturing of the relationship.
Jon, the UAE is a small country with about 1 million citizens. but it's increasingly seeking to play a global role. How does it do that?
You know, the UAE has positioned itself as a bridge, as a crossing point. There's a huge amount of Chinese trade that goes through the UAE to other countries in the Middle East, to Africa, and to Europe. It stops off in the UAE. UAE Airlines, both Emirates and Etihad, have travelers from all over the world. And when you combine that with some oil wealth, the ability to build big things, a commitment to build a good regulatory system, it's been a place where a lot of people feel comfortable and a lot of people feel I can do business, and doing business there helps me and it helps the UAE.
And the UAE is growing its ties with the United States, China, and Russia simultaneously, despite great power tensions. How are they navigating all three of those relationships?
You know, I think there was a long time, certainly right after 9/11, when the UAE was very conscious of being the favorite Arab country of U.S. president after U.S. president. They have been building really robust ties with Russia, and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of Russians came to the UAE. They brought money to the UAE. The Emiratis have helped navigate some prisoner exchanges with Ukraine. They see themselves as having proper ties with Russia, but not necessarily intimate ties with the government. With China, it's a huge commercial relationship, but it's commercial in every way. And some people think there are 400,000 Chinese in the UAE, almost half the number of Emiratis in the world. And the amount of shipping and trading that goes on, in many ways, Dubai is a showroom for China.
How does the UAE see its role in the Gulf and in the Middle East more broadly?
You know, the UAE sees itself as the trendsetter. It sees itself as the leader. It's smaller than Saudi Arabia, a tiny fraction of the number of people, a smaller economy. But there's a way in which the competition between Abu Dhabi and Dubai has created a model for the UAE where not invented here isn't a problem. You need to be bigger and better. And they try to outdo each other within the country. And I think that there's a way in which the Emiratis try to outdo the Saudis.